gentlemen, welcome to the 4Bs. Here to have another discussion on the Constitution of these United States and current politics. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us a distinguished guest who's also a Yankee, a Red Sox, and a Cubs fan. We won't get too deep into that, but there is maybe a little schizophrenia going on here. But with us, we have Professor David Adler. He is currently the president of the Alturas Institute, a nonprofit organization created to advance American democracy by promoting the Constitution, gender equality, civic education, and equal protection of the laws. He has had in the past joint appointments in the College of Law and the Department of Political Science and has taught numerous subjects at all three universities in Idaho. He has published a book on the war power in an age of terrorism and is currently writing a book on the Reed versus Reed Supreme Court decision. Most importantly, as far as the 4Bs are concerned, is Professor Adler has been a consistent and wonderful supporter of teachers of civic education, providing a number of trainings at some of our institutes over the years, and has very much been a great advocate for teachers, high school teachers, middle school teachers, elementary teachers in the field of civic education. So before we started to record, there was a topic brought up, and this will go to Kavanaugh, because I'm pretty sure I know. But Kavanaugh, of the following three people, all right, who would you least likely want to be on a deserted island with? Ron Johnson, Ted Cruz, or Marjorie Taylor Greene?
Really?
Yeah.
Can't I just like cut myself and walk into the ocean?
Yeah, well, okay, this is America, the land of liberty and choice, and yes, you could do that too, as well.
The least likely, the one that I would not want on the island would be Ted Cruz.
Okay.
But he'd be the one most likely to come back after one day.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he would probably have some plane tickets I might be able to use.
Yeah. All right. Our subject today, ladies and gentlemen, is the American presidency, pardon power, and impeachment. And so I want to start off, Professor Adler, with kind of just a general approach to this, and that has to deal with Article 2. And we as a group have discussed this a little bit, but I think we would all agree that it is vague in its writing and its enumeration. In your opinion, was this intentional by the framers? Did they intend this article specifically to be vague? And do you believe this vagueness has caused a lot of problems over our constitutional history?
Well, thanks, Dave. First, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here with fellow educators. It's always a lot of fun. I've always had stimulating conversations, and I'm sure this will be no different. It's going to be a new experience being with the 4Bs. This will be the highlight of my month, at least. When we talk about presidential power, we're talking about an issue that is rarely beyond the front pages of the newspapers, rarely beyond the headlines on any of the network shows or cable news shows. And that's for good reason, because the presidency has become the center of American politics. Ironically, the framers of the Constitution did not have that expectation for the chief executive. Remember, of course, that James Madison referred to Congress as the first branch of government in a republic. The executive, as the framers envisioned the office and as they designed Article 2, was an official whose responsibilities were pretty narrow, pretty slender, and they were to consist primarily of enforcing laws and policies enacted by Congress and making appointments to office. And that very narrow view of the executive, of course, reflected the framers' profound fear of executive power. Remember, that founding generation lived in dread fear of a powerful executive. They had experienced tyranny firsthand under King George III. Their sweeping understanding of history suggested that across the globe, executives had often exploited people for their own selfish interests. And the last thing the framers wanted to do when they drafted Article 2 was to create an embryonic monarchy on American soil. So, to your point, they granted the president only very few powers, specifically enumerated powers. And I would say that rather than being vague, Article 2 was designed simply to allocate specifically enumerated powers so as to check presidential power. As James Madison said in the convention, the great aim with respect to presidential power was to confine and define it so as to move the country beyond the period of the prerogative powers as they had been exercised by the King of England, which were beyond definition. So interestingly, we find that the framers were very keen to create out of the executive only a second branch of government. But to your point, Dave, over the course of American history, the presidency has grown tremendously in responsibilities through assertions of powers, some warranted, many unwarranted. And more, the American people look to the president to solve all of the nation's problems. And that means as a political official, the president is likely to assert powers necessary to meet the demands and the interests and the needs of the American people. Otherwise, that president will be perceived as weak. And of course, the pardon power and the impeachment power are right at the center of controversy surrounding the president these days and have been from time to time throughout American history.
David, I had a question. I was looking over a few things this afternoon in regards to this, and I was struck by, I think it was Sherman, King, Madison, they all in the convention, when they were talking about the pardon power, they were all advocating it being shared with the Senate, and I think in various degrees of commitment on their part. So I'm struck by the fact that at some points they seem to like Montesquieu's separation, and at others they're not real. Well, they don't seem to be bound by the principles tightly by the principles of Montesquieu and separation. So what's your assessment of their, at least at the convention? Now it changes a little bit in ratification, but at least at the convention, what's your assessment of them being willing to share that with the executive and the Senate?
Well, those are great questions, Tim. And as you know, while the framers were committed to separation of powers as a major doctrine, particularly to outline the separate functions according to the categories with which we're all familiar, executive, legislative, and judicial, nonetheless, as Madison said, it was important to blend these powers so as to provide the key checks on the exercise of power. And that was more important to them because when you look through the Constitution, you find very few powers granted to the president, for example, that are a source of substantive or important policymaking opportunities that are unilateral in nature. And that is borne out by their fear of a strong executive. And so when they talked about the pardon power, as you point out, and sharing it with the Senate, those were early thoughts about preventing corruption, preventing bribery, for example, which, as you know, was a pretty familiar theme coursing through the debates in the summer of 1787. Sometimes, by the way, Americans find it hard to believe that our founding fathers, paragons of virtue, saw among themselves the possibility of a president who might be vulnerable to bribery. And so check power at every turn, I think, was the theme. And of course, as they considered the idea of a blended power or shared power with respect to the pardon power, there would be a number of reasons why that ultimately would fail, not the least of which is, as Hamilton explained, your favorite Hamilton, explained that if in fact you vest that awesome power, that very broad discretionary power in one person, the very fact of vesting it in one person and drawing the attention of the entire nation would elevate that sense of responsibility involved in deciding whether or not to grant a pardon, because the framers believed, naively or not, that a president might be closely scrutinized with respect to every action, and that scrutiny would bring a sense of humility to the exercise of executive power. That may or may not exist any longer. Interesting subject to contemplate, I think.
Yeah, I forget which, it wasn't a Federalist paper, but there was a Federalist who wrote, the shame of history if they misuse this power would be this tremendous check on their willingness to use it. And, of course, you have to chuckle at some of that.
Shouldn't that shame of history, shouldn't that be such a great weight that nobody would dare to act in a way that would lend itself to ostracism or great criticism? Who would do that, right?
Well, yeah, you're assuming people care about history, but yeah.
We all do here. The 4 Bs do. I know.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, it's kind of a follow-up question from Tim's, and I'm wondering, for the students, when they think about the pardon power, should they necessarily also be thinking about how that is juxtaposed with the impeachment power? That as the founders were putting this kind of machine together, they saw those as kind of playing off each other.
Yeah, that's a really great question, because in fact, in the convention, the fear of granting to the president the sweeping pardon power exercised by kings in very reckless ways inspired a great deal of concern among the founders. And yet, for a variety of reasons, they decided to grant that awesome power, probably the most imperial of the president's powers, to that office. And so then, given their great concerns about the possible abuse of the pardon power, they wondered, how do we check this? And there's almost, and this could be a movie, I think, in the Constitutional Convention as they're talking about the pardon power. And they are obviously very familiar with the way that English kings had abused it to serve their own political and financial interests. After all, kings in England had introduced the idea of granting a pardon to those in debtor prison. And the king would come in and say to all those people, if you can pay this many pounds, I'll grant you a pardon. Of course, it was an odd question, because if you're in debtor's prison, you wouldn't be able to pay the debt, or the ransom, essentially, that the king was seeking. Well, kings were pretty smart, and they said, okay, I will essentially grant you a pardon if you promise to pay later. I think this is the beginning, by the way, of the layaway plan, so familiar to American shoppers. I'm not sure, I'm going out on a limb here. It might be the 17th century version of a layaway plan. So to your good question, I think that the framers seized upon impeachment as a means of curbing a president's appetite for abusing power. And of course, James Wilson mentioned in the convention, if the president abuses the power to a great degree, then the president could be impeached. Hamilton also said the same thing. So I think, and I'm really glad you asked that, because I think it's important for citizens to think about the two as being paired. That because in our system, it would ring strange to grant to the president an unlimited pardon power. That would be an outlier in our constitutional system, where every other power is checked. And of course, the framers didn't do it. And on occasion, when the Supreme Court, unfortunately, has resorted to saying in dictum, mind you, that the president's pardon power is unlimited, A, it was unnecessary and it's just dictum, but B, it's wrong. And while the president's pardon power is indeed capacious, it is subject to some limitations. And the president should be mindful of abusing the pardon power, lest it bring the penalty of impeachment or indeed judicial review itself, as the court would later say.
Chris?
Yeah, just a couple quick things here. For students that are watching this, dictum or dicta is when the Supreme Court goes beyond what they need to do in answering the constitutional questions. Probably Chief Justice Taney's most famous in Plessy, or excuse me, in Dred Scott decision. So when Dr. Adler uses that dictum, that's that term. I would also tell students to think about looking at Fed 47 through 51, because Tim mentions Montesquieu earlier and the separation of powers. And Montesquieu, as many as students will know, was the most quoted of the writers and the big proponent of separation of powers. But if you read 47 through 51, Madison lays out the argument of why, what Montesquieu was looking at was the English Constitution and why our Constitution needs to do what we do with our powers, as Dr. Adler alluded to. And certainly the concept of putting the pardon power in the hands of one as opposed to the hands of the many, is kind of easier to put all your eggs in one basket so you can watch that basket, right? So you can use that impeachment power, as Dr. Adler said. So my question was, I'm going to bring in some presentism here. I know Tim loves this. If the pardon power has been so controversial, which it kind of has been, right? I think would you agree that it's been somewhat controversial, especially given that these many pardons are given on the way out the door, right? Would you make recommendations for modifying the pardon power? Would you make any constitutional recommendations for how we could modify that pardon power today?
I think that's a really important point, because, of course, in the last, it would be, let's say 45 to 50 years, the exercise of the pardon power has become increasingly controversial. For most of our history, it was relatively non-controversial, with the exception of a few occasions. The grant of broad amnesty to Confederate soldiers by Lincoln and Johnson, and a few other episodes. But for the most part, the pardon power, I think, had been exercised pretty judiciously, and it didn't inspire a great deal of controversy until Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon in September of 1974. And for many people, that brought the pardon power center stage. And then, as you point out, Chris, on a couple of other occasions, pardons have become more controversial. You could take a look at them through the Reagan administration, through the George Bush, H.W. Bush administration, Bill Clinton, and obviously through the Trump administration. But I think when we look at the potential for abuse, and that's what has, I think, become increasingly worrisome, and particularly the potential that a president would use the pardon power to promote his or her own circumstances, whether in a personal way, a political way, or even in a financial way. I think that we have reached the time where we need to look at some remedies. And my own proposal that I suggested, I don't know how many, 30 odd years ago. So when I was, 3 years old, probably, is an amendment, is a constitutional amendment that would essentially provide that if both houses in Congress, the House and the Senate, by a 2/3 vote would vote to overturn a presidential pardon within a limited time period, let's say, 3 to 6 months or so, that would provide a corrective device which would seldom be used, but it's there to prevent the exercise of the pardon power in a way that represents a flagrant abuse of its historic purposes. So I think I have grown to like that more and more, particularly given the fact that President Trump made the assertion that he could pardon himself. The assertion that had been at least briefly entertained by Richard Nixon in '74 when he asked his attorney, might he pardon himself for what he expected to be criminal charges tied to the Watergate break-in. So I think we've reached a time where the nation needs to seriously entertain that, because after all, if a president can pardon himself or herself someday, then that president could escape justice. And that too would ring strange in our system, I believe, where once more, every significant power is checked.
Professor, again, we've kind of, these two go hand in hand, but in reality, isn't the impeachment power a parchment power, a paper power, that in real life, it has virtually no meaning? And we've had, so few impeachments in our constitutional history. And we all know, especially as historians, we got a lot of corrupt and at least people who sat in the executive office and performed a lot of misdeeds there. So, is there some kind of disconnect here, or how do you explain that?
That's alleged corruption, Dave. That's alleged corruption.
Really.
And I'll interject real quickly here before David gets at this. I mean, the way I read the Federalist Anti-Federalist debates is the Federalists oversold it, and the Anti-Federalists saw right through it and played the BS card. I mean, it really is remarkable how easy the Anti-Federalists, how familiar the Anti-Federalist argument, because that's the standard Federalist argument. We have impeachment. That's why he's not a monarch. And the Anti-Federalists just blister them and they say it will be seldom used. So I think that should come to mind when we think about the quote failure of using that. I'm sorry, David. Go ahead.
Well, can I ask you and Professor Adler? I mean, was there I understand the thought going behind of not having a simple majority vote that could obviously run amok, but 2/3 seems to be such a high wall that I just especially in our modern times see that never being achieved. Was there any discussion of somewhere in between?
Well, there was some discussion. There was some discussion of the advisory council doing the dirty deed. I mean, they dismissed the House, way too passionate, way out of control with their emotions. So some smaller group. So this most of their discussion boiled down to either Senate or at that time they were still talking about an advisory council to the executive. But yeah, I'm sorry, I forgot your question, David.
Well, again, part of the problem we face is that the high standard we have,
right.
2/3 of the Senate.
Right.
I understand why they probably didn't want to go a simple majority, and I'm just wondering, in the discussion on the topic, was there any discussion of a middle ground, their majority plus 5 or something?
I don't recall seeing any numbers. Maybe David, you can shed any light on that. I don't recall.
No, I think they're right. I agree with you, Tim, and I really like these questions, Dave. The framers had to engage in a delicate balancing act when it came to impeachment, because on the one hand, remember, they wanted to provide for presidential independence, separation from Congress, and if they made it too easy for the president to be impeached and removed, then the president would always be looking over his shoulder. And so that's why they couldn't simply act on the basis of a majoritarian premise. And so then they had to decide, well, how high a wall to erect, as you point out, Dave. And the 2/3 was simply a number that seemed to fit other circumstances, right? The treaty power and so forth. So when the framers think about the question of how high a wall to create, this number simply came naturally. It came naturally, not magically, because remember at the time we had 13 states, and the impeachment and removal, particularly the removal by senators from the 13 states, would almost ensure some cross section of agreement across the nation. So it wouldn't just be a single region that could remove a president. And so this would would require a sense of national unity on the great question of removing a president. And of course, the other thing was that elections should be conducted to seat a president. You don't want us to easily overturn those elections by resort of an impeachment. But the other reason I really like about your question is the impeachment power, which the framers really believed, and they regarded as the grand inquest of the nation, so as to save the nation from a tyrannical president or a president who excessively abused his power and subjected the nation to great harm. Impeachment, as Ben Franklin said, was necessary. Otherwise, there'd be no recourse but to assassination, because that's how people had to remove executives in other countries. So they had great hope. But to your point, over the course of history, I think what we've seen is that the Senate has almost surrendered its power. I see that particularly in the case of the two recent controversial Senate trials involving President Trump. Or even in other situations where the Senate might have removed the president. I think partisan politics have become so large that the Senate is depriving itself of its constitutional responsibility to make that awesome decision. And it is awesome, to be sure. And so I guess I would say, I would think the framers of the Constitution would be surprised at the spinelessness of Congress and its proclivity for surrendering its important powers. And this, to go back to your excellent points in the opening, it's just one more reason to explain why the presidency has ascended to the highest realm in American politics, far beyond the framers' thoughts.
Yeah, I think this is where, I mean, to understand the why of this, like, it's not like the House and the Senate won't impeach justices or judges. I mean, they've used the impeachment power, just not against the president. And I think this is where some understanding of culturally what the president means throughout our history. I mean, this combining of the head of state and head of government, right? I mean, we know that in a parliamentary system, it takes a 50% plus one vote to get rid of the head of government through a vote of no confidence. And as you were just saying, to get rid of head of state, that takes a bloody revolution, right? And so it's interesting to me just to think about why we have been so hesitant to use this power historically, when Hamilton said it should be used if the executive violates the public trust. I mean, my goodness, we could probably think of many occasions where the president has done that. And I think it's because it's the symbolic nature of this office as much as anything else. Our sort of cultural acceptance of the president being kind of king-like, even though we do not establish that in Article 2. At least that would be kind of my perspective on it.
I think it reminds me of Lee Hamilton when he spoke during the Iran-Contra hearings. He said, if you're going to attack the king, you better kill the king.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when the Iran-Contra hearings coming after Reagan and how that played out. So David, I'm going to throw, this is kind of a softball I ask the students all the time, given what we were just talking about. So do you see this as an abdication of power or a usurpation of power? When we see this shift, this emphasis, as Mike was just talking about, this emphasis now in how everybody looks to the executive to solve all their problems, right? He's the man behind the curtain, right? So has this been an abdication of power by Congress or a usurpation of power by the executive?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And the reality is that what we're looking at is some sort of lousy constitutional cocktail that explains how the integrity of the Constitution has been,
Now you're talking.
drained.
Yes, yes.
Integrity and I think we have to name that. We need, having identified a constitutional cocktail, I leave it to the 4 Bs.
Well, I think the ratios of 3/5 will come into play in some kind of.
There we go. I can see this is going to inspire some really high-level thoughts. Happy to contribute to high-level thoughts.
Sure.
I think the ascendancy of the presidency is, say, 2/3 usurpation and 1/3 abdication. And that we might look at a little bit more narrow formula. But I think a lot of it does go to Mike's good observations, and that is it's almost a cultural phenomenon in our country that Americans can't quite bring themselves to say, we have in our system of government a tripartite division of authority, and we're going to make it our responsibility to know which powers and responsibilities are vested in each respective branch, so that we, as well-informed, engaged citizens, can identify how the Constitution entrusts certain powers and duties to particular branches, so that we can go to that branch and say, you people are failing your responsibilities here. To Congress, for example, Congress, you have the awesome decision to decide when to take the nation to war, not the president. You in Congress have the authority to make these important decisions in other areas. The convenience, I suppose, bolstered by the incredible media attention that's heaped on the presidency, leads so many citizens, and I wonder if sometimes your students voice this concern. I hear it a lot wherever I go, leads citizens to say, well, it's the president's duty. The president should raise taxes. The president should cut taxes. The president should balance the budget. The president should stop spending so much money. I mean, it's endless and it's mindless, frankly. And so there's a failure of civic responsibility. But so long as the citizenry, to amplify Mike's point, identifies the president as a modern day king, who is responsible to be not only administrator-in-chief, commander-in-chief, priest-in-chief, and everything else that we expect to be solved, I don't know that we can return Americans to a proper understanding of how the Constitution allocates powers, divisions of power, responsibility. And that is a real problem for civic education. And I know you 4Bs are going to have to look deeply into your cups of constitutional cocktails to figure out how to entrust the citizenry with greater responsibility to know which powers are granted to which branch of government.
Well, just to back that up too, and for the students watching, I remember in 2016, during the campaign, one network had a commander-in-chief forum with Clinton for a little bit and then Trump for a little bit. This is during the campaign. It was on an aircraft carrier. So this is how they would handle being commander-in-chief. And my students, thankfully, were like, well, wait a minute. There's not commander-in-chief until the armed services are called into service and the Congress does the calling. So why are they having this? So the idea that the media perpetuates this, and so that's a very frustrating point.
Well, Chris,
I share your students' concerns. It's a real complaint of my own. You think about the role of language, and to be very discerning. The president is commander-in-chief once the troops have been called out. The problem with that careless use of language to refer to the president always as commander-in-chief is it continues to hype the powers and the role of the president in our system, right? Even so, it's not when we're involved in military hostilities. Another, along those same lines, a complaint I have is that people in the executive branch have, for at least 20 years, it's about the time I first caught it, for at least 20 years have started referring to the executive branch as the government. Well, this is the government's position. And that sounds very much like a phrase that they would use in England, right? With the parliamentary system where the prime minister is the government. Not in America. How can the president claim to be the government when in fact Congress is the government and the judiciary? So I think there's another task for us to help our students be attentive to the use or abuse of constitutional language and even the explosive role of political language.
Well, to Chris, to what your thoughts and well, to all of you, doesn't the fact that once we go to a standing professional army change that whole original dynamic from the Constitution? Yeah, he's commander in chief when Congress calls out the troops, but now with our military situation, those troops are pretty much perpetually called out, aren't they? And therefore he does take that 24/7 role as commander in chief.
I think you're right, Dave, but I'd also like to interject that at the founding, a lot of their discussion about pardoning power was within the context of pardoning his associates. And there also was a lot of discussion around the pardoning power, how it would intersect with his role as the military leader. In other words, would he, if the military was stepped out of line, would he be prone to pardon them very easily? So a lot of the discussion at the founding.
My dog just got out the door. I'll be right back. Sorry.
Okay. So there was some discussion about that even at the founding. Now, could they have imagined what it's like now? Probably not. But it is interesting that they did talk about the intersection of the pardoning power with his associates, which would be called the cabinet, or the military. And so it's interesting that so much of the pardoning power has not been, up until maybe recently, has not been associates within the government. It's been private individuals. I mean, even Washington, I had a brain fart there. I was trying to think who the first president was. Washington's first pardons were private citizens in the Whiskey Rebellion. So,
right.
So their concerns about who would be the beneficiary of the pardon power were, at least at the discussion at the convention and in most of the ratification, was associates in the government.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you read in the debates, Madison's notes, so they refer to that quite a bit.
Yeah.
And David, back to your point, and if I had the book, I'd hold it up. Sorry, student. But
you don't have the book?
I said school. The book's at school, so normally this is where I would hold.
No, you don't have a book. You're just saying you have a book.
It's by a historian that I really like. His name is Gary Wills. It's called Bomb Power, and it deals with the expansion of executive power after the invention of nuclear weapons. And so when we have one person has the nuclear codes, or the nuclear football, as they call it, and that one person, has that authority, that's when we see, his argument is, this is when we see a massive shift to this idea of that one guy, that commander in chief, that one guy that can save us from bad people, going all the way back to Hobbes and the Leviathan, right? So this is the idea of Wills puts out in Bomb Power. It's an excellent book on executive power, and when he sees it as an expansion.
Well, doesn't it start kind of with Teddy Roosevelt and the Great White Fleet? Again, I'm commander in chief. I've done this. Hey, you want them back? Go ahead and bring them back. But again, knowing that that was politically problematical.
Well, I would say that I think I would agree to a point, but I think to enter maybe a nuance there, Dave, is that's where I think when we start to see politics come into play, right? You want the Great White Fleet back, you want them, I sail them halfway around the world. Now you fund it and bring them back. So, the idea of challenging a sitting president, a member of Congress, what member of Congress is going to challenge him. And so I think under Roosevelt's, time in office, you start to see the politics of the situation creep in terms of.
Well, I mean, Congress gave Polk a pass. Congress gave Lincoln several passes as well.
I don't know that he gave Polk. Polk lied to them. Nueces.
No, in the congressional debates, they knew they got smoke blown up their skirts.
Okay, well, let Dr. Adler jump in here.
Oh, well, thanks. You probably gone well past the first point that Dave Richmond raised. It sounds like you have. But my dog's safe. Let me just tell you, my dog's safe.
Okay.
No respect for boundaries. At any rate, sorry about that. But the question, so Dave's good question about didn't presidential ascendancy as commander-in-chief begin essentially with the creation of a standing army? What that reminds me of, Dave, is Chris's question some time ago about whether or not the rise of the imperial presidency is a function of usurpation or abdication. Here, to your point, is a good example of congressional abdication, and here's why. That in fact, it is Congress that possesses the ultimate authority to decide to deploy troops, not the president. And this has been, of course, upheld by the Supreme Court in the early 19th century. Little versus Barrowmaid, Chief Justice Marshall wrote the opinion. And what that tells us essentially is that the deployment of troops is ultimately a congressional power. Now, for convenience sake, it may be the case that Congress allows the president to deploy troops, which is what has happened. But it has to be remembered that at any point, Congress should be able to say to the president, bring those troops home. And we're aware of incidents in our history where Congress has done exactly that. For example, in 1940, Congress prohibited FDR from deploying troops outside our hemisphere because, of course, they feared that it would inject America into war. So Congress has that authority by law, certainly, and through history. So here it's abdication, I would say. Partly usurpation. It's always partly usurpation. But here Congress has abdicated its role to govern the armed forces. And there are many reasons why Congress has done that. I think that's probably what you were talking about while I was gone for an hour. And,
well, you kind of surprised me. If I heard you right, you said, to Chris's, question there that it's been 2/3 usurpation and 1/3 abdication. And I know my view is it's been 9/10 abdication. Oh. So I'm curious, or if you could expand on that a little bit of why.
In other words, David, explain why David's so wrong.
Well, I would certainly quarrel with that supposition that Dave's wrong. I could not bring myself to agree. I may have to revise this cocktail formula. Only experience could provide an answer as to what ingredients are for a good constitutional cocktail, I guess. But to your point, Dave, if in fact what would linger behind the premise that it's largely abdication would explain that the president's simply filling in the holes, taking up the cudgels, assuming the responsibilities and duties that Congress has failed to address, to carry out, and the problems they failed to address. And therefore, the poor president is just a victim. I have to exercise this power, even if it's not granted to me by the Constitution. And of course, in our system, if a power is granted to one branch of government, it may not be exercised by another. That's a predicate of the separation of powers, as the court has said. So what the president could say, if it's a case that Congress is failing to act as the president believes Congress should act, is he could call attention to it. and say this is a congressional power. So if we were, for example, if we could go back to the War of 1812, you remember it's James Madison urging Congress to actually declare war in accordance with the War Clause, Article 1, Section 8. Nowadays, presidents assume such broad authority that they simply act as they would like and ignore Congress. So whether it's 2/3, 1/3, or whether it's 9/10 or whatever percentage, it's a systemic problem, isn't it? It is a system-wide problem where A, to one degree or another, the president usurps power, and B, Congress abdicates. And one of the great questions is how to put our country back on what we would call a constitutional track. How do we get presidents to understand and respect the limits of their power? How do we persuade Congress to do the same? And part of the answer, I think, has to be a more enlightened citizenry that is interested in constitutional government and actually presses governmental officials to respect and to honor the Constitution. That's pretty tough, but that's where teachers assume a very vital role in our society.
I completely agree. I would just add to that, it's also going to take elected political officials to see themselves as officers in their institution, at least equal to what political party they're wearing on their uniform. I mean, I just think if there was any moment in our history where we could, as you said, Dr. Adler, kind of get us back on track, we've just went through it.
Right.
I mean, I think Jamin Raskin made a compelling argument. Like if we're not going to impeach for this, right, then what would we ever impeach for? And I think it's left the door wide open to Congress continuing to abdicate, and for the next presidents to continue to push their power. I mean, basically we've kind of documented what a total of 4 impeachments against presidents. Presidents issue pardons like they're going out, like they have no threat. They can do that as much as they want. So even with those 2 powers, the specific powers we're talking about here in this discussion, we've seen how they're kind of so out of whack. And it was a teaching moment, I think, for our citizens, this last impeachment. And I think the political elites just failed us, in terms of really trying to change that track.
Well, I have to say, I agree with you 100%. The Senate failed. They're by any measurement, historical, legal, the Senate had a responsibility to bring in a guilty verdict. And the very fact that it did not seems to me, and this goes back to, I think, Dave Richmond's earlier point, the impeachment power now seems to be a toothless tiger. And how is any president going to believe in the future that he or she can be held accountable? I think the failure to register a guilty verdict now says to a president, there is no accountability. It pains me to say that, and it sends chills up my own spine. There's no executive accountability, when in fact that was the great aim of the framers of the Constitution. Remember, their insistence on implementation of the rule of law had a precise meaning at that time, and that was subordination of the executive to the law. Now, the law, as it relates to the president, speaking in terms of impeachment, seems to be a moving target. And if the Senate is not going to bring itself to assume the responsibility, as Jamie Raskin said, what is an impeachable offense if this is not? And to that point, it raises in my mind, I'd like your views on this, it raises in my mind the question of how to instill in the Senate that it has an awesome responsibility to check the executive. It's so easy for senators to find a safe sanctuary in a bogus argument, for example, that the Senate had no jurisdiction to hold the impeachment trial. You could find about 2 legal scholars in the country that would make that argument, and they were probably on somebody's payroll. But otherwise, the evidence was clear that the Senate had that authority. And so the fact that senators sought refuge in the jurisdictional argument to say the Senate had no authority to impeach a private citizen, which is a great manipulation of the issue itself, means they did not want to have to make that critical vote on the merits of the question, did President Trump incite insurrection? Because that would put them in either the camp at that point of Donald Trump or Liz Cheney. And here's the bottom line, as far as I'm concerned. It has become crystal clear to me that what drives the behavior of most members of Congress, not all, but most, is their own longevity, their own careers. We know this as careerism. I think it is what has corrupted our system more than anything else. And that naturally leads to the question, do we want a remedy called term limits? Not a pluperfect remedy, full of warts to be sure, but how do you deal with that question of careerism, something that was far beyond the imagination of the framers of the Constitution, who could never imagine that somebody would want to go to the seat of government and spend 25, 30, 35 years. Think of Lincoln, for example, and students are familiar with this. He and his law office partner, William Herndon, had essentially made a deal. Abe said, I'll go serve a term, I'll come back, run the law office, then you go. Who would sacrifice their family, their career interest for decades? That's a real problem here. I don't have a good answer to that beyond resort to term limits.
For the students watching, I want to just make this point. We're talking about the most recent impeachment, but this was probably, correct me if I'm wrong, but this was probably the most bipartisan impeachment that we've had out of the 4, right? So this is, at least the needle has moved a little bit, but it's still frustrating is what Representative Raskin said. If we're not going to impeach for this, then oh my gosh, it doesn't really matter. And the other point is I keep thinking of, I always come back to this from Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein in that book, It's Even Worse Than It Looks. You know, there's a great line I remember in there that says we have politicians in a separation of powers government that believe they're in a parliamentary system. So the idea is they forget about this institutional jealousy, or as Madison said, that ambition being made to counteract ambition, that institutional ambition, that institutional power. And of course, that has, succumbed to the pressure of party politics. And Dave, to your point, in terms of my longevity in office, that's what I've always thought. If you want to find some of the most honest people in Washington, find a senator who said he or she is not going to seek re-election.
Yeah. So we've got just a few minutes left with Professor Moore here, and I've got to ask I think is one of the most obvious questions, and get your input, Professor Adler, and that is, can the president pardon himself?
Oh, good question. Yeah. The answer is no, for a number of reasons, Dave. Glad you raised that question for several reasons. One is that it would violate the centuries-old Anglo-Saxon principle of law that no man may be judge of his own cause, going all the way back to Sir Edward Coke in Dr. Bonham's case, 1610. It would also, of course, violate the idea, the very core principle of the rule of law, that a president is not subject to the law. If a president can pardon himself, he's no longer subordinate to the law. But we also have ample historical proof that the framers would not have considered it, in the fact that when King Charles was essentially on trial for his life and making all sorts of legal arguments, including the fact he said Parliament, the Commons does not have the authority to try the king, in those dire moments, right before the axe is to come down on his neck, he never asserted, I can pardon myself. For King Charles, who asserted every argument under the sun to win his life, he never made that claim. The fact is, Dave, the claim is preposterous. And let me not be too demonstrative here. The claim is preposterous. It would violate every sentiment the framers had for subordinating the president to the Constitution. And I hope I wasn't too vague in my answer.
Yeah, calm down, David. Calm down. Calm down.
Can I just ask a question here? Because I completely agree with that. But if I were advising a president today in this current political climate, I would advise them to do it, because I think there's a pretty good chance that that person would get away with it, given the current. Is that a right sort of advice to give to a sitting president?
Well, it is. It's good advice. It would be made by a cynical presidential advisor eager to defend his client, right? But here, and yes, you would, given this climate where the Senate refuses to carry out its checking and balancing actions, could there be a majority in both houses who would move to do what to that president? Impeach him? And if he impeaches himself, if he's impeached and the president pardons himself, then that means the president is violating the text of the Constitution. Right. Because remember, Article 2 provides the president can grant pardons for all offenses except cases of impeachment. And that's why the assertion by President Trump that he might pardon himself was extraordinary in the face that he was the person who was already subjected to impeachment. I wrote an op-ed for CNN on that specific point, and saying, in a sense, once Congress initiated the impeachment proceeding on January 13, even the theoretical possibility that the president might pardon himself was gone, because he was now the subject of impeachment, unless you believe, as some would have us believe, that the president is immune from any tentacle of the law.
Wow.
Professor Moore, we got time for one more question. What's on your mind?
I glanced at a piece by Luther Martin today, because I cannot get past 1800. And I think it's Genuine Information. That was a series that he wrote, and it was one of those chuckle out louds on this issue of pardoning. He said something to the effect that, this pardoning power is going to be so bad, and he lays out this argument, and I'm reading this, and I was thinking he must have had a Ouija board to see everything that's been going on of late. So it is interesting how the Anti-Federalists looked at this pardon power with great suspicions, and I think to get, I'm obligated to make sure the Anti-Federalists, Professor Adler, get their due here. Yeah. So it is interesting to me how prescient Luther Martin was, and even though he probably was inebriated.
Well, I was going to say, given it was Luther Martin, he certainly had a constitutional cocktail in hand.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
What I like about your reading Luther Martin is a lot of people today might pick up James Patterson or John Grisham, but there you are reading Luther Martin.
Well, yeah. The man I work for pretty much makes sure I read Luther Martin every day. So, don't you strike a broad theme there? Yeah, the framers, it's become a cliche, right? The framers roll over in their graves if they had seen what the government had become, or the president wouldn't recognize the office that they created, speaking of the presidency. All of that's true, I think. But I think the great question confronting teachers and citizens of all ages is there a desire to somehow return this country to constitutional government
and how to do it. Is there the desire, first of all? How do we instill in citizens an appreciation for the virtues and values of constitutionalism? And then how to persuade them to act, to become engaged. That requires a lot of constitutional cocktails right there.
Well, on that note,
Yes.
students and teachers, we're going to bring this segment on from Unit 4, the national questions on the American presidency and pardon and impeachment. And so we look forward to our next segment, again with Dr. Adler, which we'll be talking about Congress. So have a good day. We'll see you next bat time, next bat place. Peace, love, yogurt tacos.